listening to We Saw the Devil, an investigative and conversational true crime podcast that deep dives into fascinating criminal cases that are solved, unsolved, or ongoing. From America's Lori Vallow to Germany's Armin Meiwes, we examine and discuss the world's most shocking cases. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to follow us online. Check us out at WeSawTheDevil.com and We Saw the Devil on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't forget, you can become part of the show by backing us on Patreon. Hello everyone, you're listening to We Saw the Devil. I'm Robin, and I'm here with part 2 of the Dark Side of Disney series. In these episodes, I'll be covering the formation of Walt Disney from its humble beginnings in the 1920s through its current state as a multi-billion-dollar media conglomerate. And as with anything that large and powerful, there are a handful, or heaps in this case, of skeletons in the closet. So these episodes will be examining the good and the bad. The true story. Is Disney World really the happiest place on earth? Was Walt Disney himself anti-Semitic and a supporter of the Nazi Party, the Nazi and Hitler's regime? Was he cryogenically frozen? Was the entire story of Mickey Mouse a lie? We're going to discuss that and more. But before we get into it, quick housekeeping. You're listening to We Saw the Devil. I'm your host, Robin. Website is WeSawTheDevil.com. From there, you can find us across all social media or just search for We Saw the Devil. And if you're digging the content, please leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you're currently listening on. Fastest intro ever. I'm really excited about this series. This is one of my favorite topics, not Disney per se, but this particular era, the golden age of cinema, as everyone calls it, the classic age, where it's glitz, glamour, your big movie stars, things like that. In the previous episode, I went through a short history of film. I'm talking about like the first camera, animations, film, as well as some scandals involving actors at the time. In part 1, we left off in 1927, just as silent film was coming to an end and the talkies were taking over. The movie The Jazz Singer debuted in October of 1927, becoming the first feature-length film in American history to have synchronized dialogue. And singing, no less. In fact, the very first spoken words in that film are, quote, "You ain't heard nothing yet," as Al Jolson belts into a rendition of Toot Toot Tootsie. It had a budget of about $445,000, which translates to about $5.3 million today. It was produced and released by Warner Brothers Studios. Harry Warner, one of the brothers, believed in that film so strongly that he pawned his wife's jewelry and moved the family into a small apartment to finance the film. And then when it debuted on October 6th, it made audience members hysterical. Not only were people talking on the screen, they were full-throated singing. I mean, can you imagine what that was like? Imagine you're out there, whatever age you're at now, but you're back in 1927. You're just sitting in the theater, vibing, ready to watch your silent picture, and suddenly the screen begins to talk to you. There was sound. I mean, you would be completely and utterly gobsmacked by that. And I often have the stoner thought of, if you could bring back someone from like the 1500s, what would you show them? And I think the most popular answer is television or movies, internet, cat memes, whatever. For me, it would be movies or even an EDM concert. If you haven't seen Laser City videos on YouTube, like from the EDM shows, check it out. And then think of a pilgrim from Salem in the 1600s going to one of those shows. Like, it makes me laugh until I cry. Anyway, back to being relevant, one particular person, a 26-year-old cartoonist named Walt Disney, also caught the Jazz Singer at a Hollywood, California showing. And it completely changed his life and his career. And this episode is going to be about the man himself, Walter Elias Disney. Walter Elias Disney was born on December 5th, 1901 in Chicago. His Irish father, Elias Disney, came to the United States from Canada, and his mother, Flora, was of German and English descent. Walt was the youngest of 4 sons and would go on to have one younger sister in 1903 when he was 2 years old. When Walt was 5 years old, the Disney family moved to a farm in Marceline, Missouri, and by all accounts, he pretty much had an all-American idyllic childhood. He did chores, helped around the house, and he focused on drawing. He loved to draw, and every moment of his spare time, he was doodling. Unfortunately, his father Elias's health took a very bad downward turn, and so the family was forced to sell their farm and move to Kansas City. In Kansas City, his father bought a paper route, and because his health was so poor, 10-year-old Walt would get up every single morning at 3:30 and take care of the route on bicycle. And it's during this time when he had a little bit of extra, change, he would go see movies. He would go see silent films. And he fell in love with vaudeville and silent film actors like Charlie Chaplin and others. And he began to focus on drawing and becoming a better artist. He also began to take drawing lessons at Kansas City Institute. In 1917, at the age of 16, Walt's family moved back to Chicago so that his father could take on a job at the Ozell Jelly Company. Walt enrolled at McKinley High School. He began to draw comics for the school newspaper and attended night classes at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. And it's at that point that he really began to focus his future career on being a professional illustrator, a cartoonist. But his priorities would soon change. With World War I having raged for a couple years in Europe, America finally took notice. And Walt's older brother Roy had decided to enlist in the Navy. Walt, meanwhile, finishing his sophomore year in high school, he hated school. He detested it. He even wrote a letter to the principal telling him that he had been, quote, disgusted by his previous year there. I can't imagine doing that to my old high school principal, which I also hated school. Loved school, loved learning, loved studying, hated the people. Enamored by the film industry, Walt and his best friend Russell Moss put a large down payment on a movie camera. They wanted to make children's films. But after Walt's older brother Ray, who also joined the military, the Army in particular, came home to visit, Walt wanted to join the war effort too. He saw how Ray had changed, how he had that snazzy new uniform. It seemed like he had everything together. So he became obsessed with enlisting and going into war, World War I. And here's a direct quote from the Disney Museum. Quote, "First, he tried to sign up for the Navy, but was turned down due to his age. Next, he and his friend Russell Moss attempted the Canadian Armed Forces, except Russell was rejected for poor eyesight. Not wanting to go without each other, Walt and Russell concocted yet another plan. They would join the Red Cross Ambulance Corps, as they weren't quite as particular on the subject of age. Applying as the falsified St. John brothers, the two 16-year-olds were told that they still needed their parents' signatures for their forms as well as passports. In the meantime, Russell's mother had found a suitcase in the early stages of packing and suspected that something was afoot, alerting Walt's mother, Flora Disney. Walt confessed the plan, but Elias, his father, refused to sign the enlistment documents, exclaiming, "I might be signing your death warrant." Surprisingly, Flora took Walt's side on the matter, saying, quote, "3 of my sons have left this family in the middle of the night. Walter's determined to go, Elias, even if he has to sneak out like his brothers. I'd rather sign this paper and know where he is." Angry, Elias concluded, "Forge my name if you want, but I won't sign," storming out. Flora did. Yet Walt's actual birth year reflected 1901 would still keep him from the ambulance corps, so Walt himself, determined to go, changed it to 1900. So, on September 16th, 1918, he enlisted. And after he enlisted, he actually spent a full year in France. But by the time he arrived, the armistice agreement had already been signed. So there was no active fighting, but he did see a little bit of the aftermath. And he actually made a lot of powerful friends while he was in France, who he would then become reunited with down the road. We'll get there in future episodes. But while he was there, he would actually draw cartoons as he was able. Soldiers would pay Walt a small fee for him to draw like a little cartoon to send back home, include a little doodle on a letter. He also sent drawings and letters back to McKinley High School. So in 1919, after Ray and Roy returned to Chicago from war, Walt requested a discharge for himself. His father tried to convince him to get a job at the jelly factory, but Walt refused. I'm sure he was quote-unquote disgusted. Instead, he moved to Kansas City and got a job at the Pessman Rubin Commercial Art Studio, getting paid $50 a month as an apprentice artist. He drew advertisement illustrations for different theater programs and catalogs. This is where he met arguably the most important person in his life. That man would be known as Ub Iwerks. And I'm not joking when I say the most important person in his life. I'm saying probably like one of the most important people in the history of business as well as film. We'll get there. Ub was another artist, and he and Walt hit it off immediately. Same humor, best friends. They did everything together. But sadly, they were laid off from Pessman Rubin the following year in January of 1920. They both had the drive and the interest in starting their own illustration studio. So the two men decided to do just that. They called it Iwerks Disney Commercial Artists. However, as if any of you all know, when you go out being a consultant or contractor or anything like that, it's a bit more difficult to go out and get clients that way. And both of the men had bills to pay. So Walt left their new company to get a job at the Kansas City Film Ad Company, and then Iwerks soon joined him. There, Walt fell in love with animation. Walt was convinced that animation was the medium of the future. But his bosses at the Kansas City Film Ad Company wouldn't provide any financing for him to experiment with it or work on it. So Walt, Iwerks, and colleague Fred Harmon decided to open up an animation studio. Collectively, they created and published cell animation called Newman's Laughograms, which were mainly shown at the Newman Theater. Walt would use Aesop's fables for inspiration before moving on to well-known fairy tales. In May of 1921, he and Hartman founded the Laughogram Animation Studio, and he immediately began working on a 12-minute cartoon based on none other than Alice in Wonderland. But right as they finished Alice in Wonderland, the studio would go bankrupt. Disgusted with the Midwest and realizing that his best shot at working in film would likely be out west, Walt set out for Hollywood in July of 1923. His older brother Roy soon followed, and they founded the Disney Brothers Studios in 1923. Now, having a fully completed Alice in Wonderland cartoon called Alice's Wonderland in his pocket, he attempted to sell it to various distributors. And that's when he came across Margaret J. Winkler. Here's a name no one knows, yet she is a total Betty badass. And of course, men throughout history have gotten the credit for everything, even if, women were there or even there first. Margaret was the personal secretary for Harry Warner, obviously one of the brothers from Warner Brothers. Back during the silent film era, Warner Brothers just distributed films. They didn't actually make them or produce them. And Harry was really, really impressed with Margaret's eye for talent, as well as her negotiation deals and her ability to negotiate. Surprisingly, there actually was not an inappropriate relationship there. So when Pat Sullivan, the legendary film producer, came to Harry to get him to sign a new deal for his cartoon Felix the Cat, Harry rejected him. Instead, he went to Margaret, his secretary, and was like, "You're fucking talented. Here's some money, start your own distribution company, and sign Sullivan and Felix the Cat as your first client." So she did. She took on Felix the Cat as well as Out of the Inkwell, and soon came across a cartoon by a man named Walt Disney called Alice's Wonderland. Margaret signs Walt Disney to create a series called Alice Comedies. In the series, a young girl is filmed in live action, and she interacts with animated characters. And Margaret Winkler was so important because she was the first woman to produce and distribute animated films. A little piece of history that you don't really hear about because whenever you think of animation, you think of a handful of men, particularly Disney. But whereas Walt Disney himself at that point was just a lowly animator with no success, Margaret Winkler literally had a company and was producing and distributing her own films. She was badass. Now, if you're hoping that Margaret, the lone unicorn, being a woman in such a male-dominated world of film, became a successful billionaire because of Disney breaking out, you're going to be sorely disappointed. In 1924, Margaret had met and fallen in love with film producer Charles Mentz. They had 2 children, and Margaret's career just hit the toilet. Charles quickly swooped in and took over Margaret's role as the CEO, and even renamed the company Winkler Pictures. So much for that little taste of female empowerment there. But she still did make her mark on film history. Walt Disney was soaring high. Whereas it wasn't explosively popular, Alice Comedies did, fairly well, moderately successful. And Disney wanted to step away from drawing, and he wanted to focus more on storyboards and character development. So Walt hired all of these additional animators. He ended up bringing back his old friend Ub Iwerks, and they finally reunited at the new company. He also hired an inker by the name of Lillian Bounds. Most of the inkers in the studio were women, and most of the animators and cartoonists were men. Walt, by most accounts, was a gentleman, and he drove the Ink girls home in his brand new car almost every single day. He would drop them off one by one, and Lillian was the last stop. As they spent more time together, they began to really care for one another. Walt would take her to the movies and tea rooms, and they would go for long drives in his roadster to vineyards and orange groves. It didn't take long for love to take hold, and then they were married the following year in July of 1925. Now, Charles Mintz wasn't the businessman that his wife had been. The production cost of Alice comedies skyrocketed, and Mintz became very unhappy. So he asked Disney and Ub Iwerks to develop a new character. The result of that was Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, the first animated character for Universal Pictures, perhaps the most important cartoon character ever made. Charles Mintz had a deal with Universal Pictures, and Disney and Ub Iwerks and their company was contracted to make a character for Universal. Audiences fell in love with the cartoon rabbit. He played an accordion, he fought bad guys, he fell in love, he was very animated. They flocked to theaters in droves to see him. Up until this point, y'all, animation had been really boring and stuffy, very stiff. Walt Disney and his team, especially Ub Iwerks, they had a knack for bringing animation to life, capturing humanity and all of its emotions. So in 1927, Walt Disney took a train ride out to New York City, where Charles Mintz was based out of. And Walt planned to ask for more money and more funding. I mean, it seemed appropriate due to the success of Oswald the Rabbit. Instead, the opposite happened. Not only would Walt not be receiving an additional penny from Charles Mintz, but Charles Mintz had actually secretly hired out the entire Walt Disney Brothers studio. He poached them. Almost all of Disney's employees were gone. Charles and Winkler Pictures' main backer, Universal Pictures, had quite literally poached Disney's whole staff. On top of that, Charles reminded Walt that per their original contract, Disney didn't own Oswald the Rabbit. Universal Pictures did. So Walt was presented with two options. You can either join Universal Pictures and start, producing Oswald the Rabbit with us and our team under our direction, or start all over from scratch with almost nothing to show for it and you get nothing. Walt would send a telegram back to his brother that said, "Don't worry, everything okay." But it wasn't okay. He returned to Hollywood with his tail between his legs, not knowing what to do next. With his brother Roy, his best friend Ub Iwerks, and wife Lillian at his side, they decided to forge a path forward, unsure whether they would even achieve success like they previously had with Oswald the Rabbit. They declined Mintz's offer to sign on with Universal Pictures. Now, Walt Disney was a man who exaggerated a lot. Like, a lot. There are exactly 4,162 variations out of Walt Disney's own mouth as to the creation of the famous mouse. That being said, here's the most commonly believed story, and it's the one that Disney historians and Disney website hawks, right? You've probably heard the story. On the way back to Hollywood from Manhattan, from that really bad meeting with Charles Mintz, Walt and Lillian were on the train. Walt was racking his brain and doodling on a sketch pad, basically trying to come up with some semblance of an idea for the next character. He knew that he wasn't going to take Mintz's deal. He thought of a pet mouse that was on his desk back in Kansas City and then took Oswald's base design and transformed it into a little mouse. He showed this to Lillian and said, what about this is Mortimer Mouse? Lillian then supposedly made a quip about how the name should be something more cutesy and accessible, like Mickey. And that's the most widely told story of how Mickey Mouse was created. And I want each and every one of you to scratch that story from your memories, because what I just told you, in reality, is all bullshit. The Walt Disney Company even promotes, like I just said, promotes that as the official story of Mickey Mouse, but it's all a lie. Walt Disney was a brilliant man in many, many ways, and especially because he knew the importance of marketing, good storytelling, and messaging. And that's all Mickey's creation story is, feel-good marketing. In reality, nothing was created on that train from New York to Los Angeles. Absolutely nothing. Stressed out and hitting rock bottom, Walt arrived at his studio to work with his team on the final few Oswald the Rabbit cartoons that they'd been contracted for. In the evening, Disney and his best friend, Ub Iwerks, would lock themselves in Ub's office. Ub was one of the most brilliant animators in history, and he is still considered one of the best animators and most talented in the history of the medium. He would sometimes draw 600 to 700 frames per day. Imagine looking at like a little cell frame, right? Like for comics and stuff, and drawing 600 to 700 of those a day. That's the level of his talent. Knowing they had no time to waste whatsoever to line up their, next character, Ub began to draw variations of Oswald, and they decided on a mouse. Earliest versions of Mickey looked considerably more like Oswald before they ended up rounding it out the edges and the ears and the nose and the face and looking more like the Mickey Mouse that we know today. And we're going to get to the drama surrounding this later on in another episode, but can you imagine Ub Iwerks is 100% the vision and the creator of Mickey Mouse, yet Walt Disney took full credit for it his whole life. That's super fucked up, but I digress. So Ub and Walt were steadfast and basically put all of their eggs in Mickey Mouse's basket. So Ub, being the workhorse that he was, got to animating. Don't forget, guys, Walt Disney was actually a really bad illustrator. He wasn't a good animator. By all accounts, he just, he was okay, but he wasn't great. Ub was apparently amazing. And as soon as Walt Disney could get away from animating, he did, because he wasn't good enough. So Ub got to animating and finished it up, and the first cartoon featuring Mickey Mouse was called Plain Crazy. It was inspired by Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic. It premiered in Hollywood on May 15th, 1928 as a test screening, but it failed. It did not get any distribution. The second Mickey Mouse cartoon, The Gallopin' Gaucho, also failed, did not pick up distribution. Apparently, the third time was a charm because they also changed locations. The next one, Steamboat Willie, premiered on November 18th, 1928 in New York's Colony Theater. And this is one of the most iconic films in history, not even just when you're talking about animation. Animation, certainly, but just in terms of movie history, cinema history as well. It was one of the first cartoons to ever utilize synchronized sound. If you recall in the last episode, and also I briefly mentioned it in the very beginning of this one, the movie The Jazz Singer. Disney and Iwerks had just seen it the previous year, and it changed their lives. And they were both determined to use synchronized sound on a cartoon, which was unheard of. I mean, you barely get synchronized sound in any capacity in film. The talkies were just starting to happen. Imagine a cartoon suddenly having sound. The rest is history. And they absolutely stunned their audiences. And I highly suggest you take just a few minutes and watch it. It's on YouTube, and there's even been a remastered version of it that's been brought up to HD. It's just 7.5 minutes long. And it was immediately the talk of Broadway and all of New York City. It even landed a 2-week run on Broadway, and Walt received $1,000 for it, which at that time was the highest amount of money ever paid for a cartoon on Broadway. Previously, the record was like $250. It was so popular, and people all across New York City, and then also Hollywood, after word traveled, were so interested in it, he was paid $1,000. The mere idea that a cartoon animal like a mouse could steer a boat, play instruments, smoke a cigar, fight, was something completely fantastical, and sound made that immersion happen so much more. In 1932, the distinguished critic Gilbert Seldes noted, quote, "The great satisfaction in the first animated cartoons was that they used sound properly. The sound was as unreal as the action. The eye and the ear were not at war with each other, one observing a fantasy, the other an actuality." And we have to think about what time it was with film. I mean, we're now in the talkies. King Kong would come out in 1933 during the Great Depression. It used a wide variety of techniques, including live action and stop animation. Kong literally stomps on native people and crushes a few people in his mouth. I mean, films barely had sound, you guys. And then this sort of violence shows up on the big screen. People passed out. There's a reason why Universal Studios had I believe it still has it, the King Kong ride, because it was such a cornerstone of film. Some of my favorite filmmakers report seeing King Kong when they were children and just it changing their lives. And that's what that movie did as a marker in cinema history. I mean, it was just like, wow. I mean, imagine when we go see big monster movies like Godzilla, modern King Kong, Cloverfield. Except imagine never having heard sound before and then all of a sudden you're seeing Godzilla with full sound. It was insanity. Plus, huge apes swinging from the Empire State Building. Audiences went wild, just as they had done in 1931 with Frankenstein. And this was a golden age of cinema. I mean, you had Todd Browning's Freaks, The Mummy, Tarzan and the Ape Man, Vampire, White Zombie, Murders in the Rue Morgue, Sign of the Cross. Some absolute lit blockbusters came out of this time. This is truly the golden era of film, and this is something that we're going to be discussing in the next episode because I want to try to stay time period relevant here. This is my favorite area in pop culture. It's my favorite time in history. When I have time, I do try to read biographies, and it's always from this era, like 20s through 50s. So I'm really super excited to go on to episode 3 and get more into it. So I wanted to stop here because this is where Walt Disney takes off. This is where the Disney and Ub Iwerks, Mickey Mouse just makes his appearance on the world stage. So we're going to stop here, and then the next couple episodes are probably going to be about this period. So much drama. For all of the glamour that people remember the 20s and 30s of Hollywood for, it was so dark and gross. So I'm excited to talk about all of that. But again, that's it for today, guys. You've been listening to We Saw the Devil. I am Robin. Don't forget to check out the website at wesawthedevil.com. I also released an episode yesterday, which was an update on the probable cause affidavit of the arrest of Richard Allen, who is the accused Delphi murders murderer. If you've been following that case, I basically go through an explainer of why he was arrested. What evidence did the police come across or find that enabled him to be arrested? Also, in the next couple days, I'll have a news update episode and the information with the Moscow 4, which I can't reiterate enough, guys, how that case has destroyed me. Home invasion is my absolute worst nightmare. It's my worst fear. The only other thing in this world that I'm afraid of is snakes. And the fact that 4 lives were lost in such a heinous and brutal manner, it has shaken me. So I'll have a news update for that as well over the coming days. Until next crime.